Hello, I'm Scott Thompson, and welcome to After 10. Studying abroad, traveling around the world, and taking on an internship at a multinational company. These are all great ways to expand your horizons. However, global volunteer programs can offer a unique opportunity that the others cannot, as they contribute to development of the individual and the international community. On today's After 10, we connect to Bonn, Germany, and the headquarters of United Nations Volunteers for discussion with its executive coordinator, Richard Dictus. Stay tuned to find out how you can get involved and make the world a better place.
The Universal Declaration on Volunteering says that volunteering brings to life the noblest aspirations of humankind. In 1970, the UNV was established by the UN General Assembly and has sent volunteer workers around the world for aid projects for developing nations. 7,500 United Nations volunteers have been sent to 130 different countries so far to take part in a variety of volunteer programs. Korea signed a Memorandum of Understanding with the UNV and established a trust fund to support volunteer programs in the 1980s. Korea has contributed about $8 million to the UNV and its programs since. What kinds of changes can young volunteer workers bring to the international community? Meet Richard Dictus, Executive Coordinator of UNV, who has strived hard to promote overseas volunteer programs around the world.
Mr. Dictus, I know your schedule is rather hectic these days. We appreciate you taking time out of your schedule to speak with us. How are you?
Well, doing very well. Had many opportunities now to travel past various countries where the United Nations Volunteer Program is active, where either we are working with organizations and countries to deploy volunteers to development, or in developing countries themselves to see how those volunteers have been doing. So yes, the schedule is hectic, but to be working with young people around development, around peace, and around volunteering is just the biggest privilege that I've ever had in my career.
Now let's begin with an introduction to the United Nations Volunteers Program. Tell us about it.
Well, the United Nations Volunteer Program was created in 1971 in order to bring in the volunteer factor to the work of the United Nations, to essentially bring volunteerism in order to create a stronger relationship between the work of the United Nations and people, communities, and the development and transformation at the very local levels. Up until that time, the United Nations had been very much a policy-driven organization. If we look at the current day and age, you see that there are about 6,400 volunteers working in 132 countries in the world. They themselves come from 139 different nationalities. And in that sense, I think the United Nations volunteer programs is one of the biggest signs of global solidarity that actually currently exists. About 60% of the volunteers are coming from the global south and are working in the global south themselves. And this is therefore also one of the main channels of technical cooperation amongst developing countries. We are looking ahead at the way in which volunteerism will be supporting the new Sustainable Development Goals that will be coming out as a successor to the Millennium Development Goals, because all the volunteers that we currently have are deeply employed and engaged in making Millennium Development Goals happen across the world, making sure that everybody has enough to eat, making sure that children are born in safety, that there are schools that they can go to, making sure that there is a better environment for people to live in. Again, as I said, the biggest outpour of global solidarity, the United Nations Volunteer Program.
There are plenty of volunteer programs throughout the world. The Peace Corps in the U.S. comes to mind. How does the UNV differ from volunteer programs you might see in other countries?
Well, we actually don't differ that much, except of course that we are multinational. So we have 159 different kind of assignments within the UN system. We have 139 different nationalities that are providing volunteers for the system. And in that sense, I think we are significantly different. If you are KOICA, one of the largest volunteer organizations in the world, by the way, you have 2,000 international volunteers. But all of these volunteers, of course, are Korean, collaborating with the Korean development programs that have been agreed between the host government and the Korean government. The United Nations, in that sense, is different because we have 26 United Nations agencies that are collaborating at this moment in 139 countries, and 132 of those countries, United Nations volunteers, are supporting that business model. Our business model is different, but a volunteer is a volunteer. A volunteer is somebody who comes forward without any expectation of remuneration or personal reward in order to volunteer their time, their commitment, their energy and drive to make the world a better place. And it's very interesting to see if you are, every year there is International Volunteer Day, which we celebrate on the 6th of December. And we then always bring the volunteers of the different countries together with the United Nations volunteers. And the volunteers always recognize each other from whichever nationality they come from, because they're all driven by the same internal motivation to become a better human being, but also to contribute to the good of mankind.
Let's talk about results then, and the greater good of contributing to mankind. What kind of changes have we seen in the international community as a result of the UNVs' efforts?
Well, volunteers are very value-driven. They basically work on the interface with human beings. They work, for instance, in UNHCR as legal protection officers, or they will work in UNICEF as child protection officers, to give you examples where they are working on the protection of the refugees children. But also, we have some great examples. Young Son, a Korean volunteer who is currently working in Nicaragua with UN Women. And she has a beautiful story where she is working with another group of volunteers from actually different countries to help in a school in the shanty towns of Managua, the capital of Nicaragua. And she tells a story of how she is sitting there during her lunch break, and she actually sees that the schoolyard is very dirty, is not very well maintained, is not very well cleaned up. So after she's finished her lunch, she decides to get a plastic bag and to start pick up different pieces of rubble in order to clean up the schoolyard. And as she is doing that, she actually notices that the children of this school are looking around themselves and are picking up the rubbish also. And within 1 hour they had cleaned up the schoolyard, and everybody was really, really very happy because the schoolyard was now a better place for children to play in. And she always narrates that as she went home that day, when she got close to her own home, she actually saw that her street was also not that very clean, not that very neat. And she decided the next day to get a garbage bag and to start cleaning up. And with that, she actually, in her own environment, organized a complete cleanup campaign with her neighbors in her street. And this just basically proves that volunteering is not only about how you help other people to change their lives, but volunteering changed the lives of the volunteers. It adds value to the volunteers. It's very much a two-way street. So if you look at the contribution that volunteers are making to the international community, what you see is that all the volunteers that have worked with the United Nations become ambassadors for the United Nations values, for the contribution that the United Nations is making in different countries when they return to their own country, because they have seen so much, they have lived through so much. But at the same time, it has made the United Nations itself a much more human organization and much better understood in the countries where we work.
Korea, as you mentioned, was a country in desperate need of foreign aid at one point, has now become a donor country. In what way is Korea today contributing to the UNV's efforts?
Well, Korea is at this moment one of our best partners. We are working with Korea not just on sending Korean volunteers to different United Nations programs. They basically contribute about $1.3 million a year to our organization in order to bring in more Korean volunteers. But we're also working together on the importance of volunteering as a shared value across the world. We basically have discussions about how to have joint research on volunteering. How important is volunteering in Korean society, and what lessons can be learned for other countries that are moving from poverty into middle income countries, and now, like Korea, really becoming one of the wealthier countries in the world. So that relationship and that experience and how we can translate it and how we can see the role that volunteering has played in the transformation of your country has many lessons for other places in the world. And we're trying to work together on making that happen. And lastly, I think at this moment we are looking to see if we can create more voluntary opportunities for young Korean people to join the United Nations. When I was in Korea most recently, I had the opportunity to speak to the National University in Seoul as well as the Pusan University in Busan. And in there, we started to develop plans to bring young university students who are doing their master's degree to a number of programs in the United Nations to see how they would be able to learn more about the multilateralism, about the work that the United Nations does, discover things about other countries, and still manage to maintain the work on their university degree to earn credits towards university. These are very forward-looking ideas where we are working with the top-notch universities in Korea in order to engage more young people in the United Nations. And I can tell you, we need more young people. We need their ideas. We need their energy. We need their drive in order to make sure that as an organization we remain relevant to the future generations that are to come. So a very exciting relationship with Korea at this moment.
When a nation like Korea is so engaged in international volunteering programs, what are the benefits that that country sees in terms of brand value, in terms of the way it's viewed throughout the world?
I always liken this a little bit to the way that a parent is very proud when somebody makes a comment about how well their children are behaving or how well they are doing in school. If you take a look at some of the young volunteers that you have out working in other countries, I gave you the example of Yuang Son, and how she basically shows some very fundamental values from the Korean society and how they actually then reflect so very well on your country. I believe that every volunteer is an ambassador for Korea, shows the values that sit in your society, the good things that you have achieved yourself. And with that, your country gathers honor, gathers a lot of stature. The fact that you are actually at this moment sending out as a nation nearly 4,000 volunteers per annum, 2,000 volunteers with KOICA, and about another 2,000 volunteers to different private initiatives. And this basically is invaluable because it establishes friendship and it establishes contact, it establishes mutual understanding. It probably will also contribute to the way that your own society is beginning to see the outside world and its own engagement with the outside world. But it creates relationships that are obviously enhancing Korea's stature in the international community.
And when was the last time you yourself came to Korea, and what was on your agenda while you were here?
Well, I very much came in order to meet with the government, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, to meet with KOICA, to meet with various universities, to meet with youth interest groups, to meet with young people, because I wanted to inform myself, first of all, what is this incredible country that is sending so many great volunteers all over the world who are really making a difference for peace and development? But I also wanted to make sure that we discussed the future relationship. And we have definitely confirmed with the government a forward-looking engagement of youth volunteers in the United Nations. Probably we will be having somewhere up to 30 international youth volunteers working with different agencies of the United Nations next year. We also confirmed relationships with KOICA around the collaboration on volunteer knowledge, on volunteer training, and an engagement between COICA, the Peace Corps, the International Red Cross, and UNV on joint conferences, which was very important. And finally, we laid the foundation for a university volunteer program, probably involving the National University in Seoul, as well as the Pusan University in Busan.
I would imagine that having a passion to help people would be the top requirement for taking part in these volunteer programs. But of course, a lot of preparation is necessary as well. What does United Nations Volunteers do to help support people who do want to go overseas and help people out?
Well, the first thing is that with Korea we have what is called the Youth Volunteer Program. And that is one of the first steps that young people can take if they want to volunteer for the United Nations internationally. The preparation process is basically that you do need to be able to speak your languages. You need to have 2 United Nations languages. 1 sometimes is enough, but you need to be able to really speak the languages. And then, of course, you need to have knowledge that you can share. You need to have a good education. We're talking here sometimes really about people who have master's degrees, who can then subsequently provide technical advice and technical support to different parts of the United Nations. A UN volunteer is slightly different because it works more closely with people, it works more closely within governments, and is part of the United Nations system. And in that sense, we are always striving for the highest level of excellence. So we're looking for good candidates, people who combine very much the will to help, the drive to come up with new ideas and to work with people, with a good education, and later on, good professional experience. If you take a look outside of the youth program that I mentioned, the United Nations volunteer, the average volunteer is 37 years old, has 12 years of professional experience, and at the very minimum, a master's degree. In that sense, if I can put it like that, the United Nations volunteer are the elite volunteer corps of the world. At least that's what we're trying to make it look like.
Another byproduct of volunteering overseas, I would have to think, would be the fostering of regional experts. How does that factor into to all of this?
Well, basically, it's about the exchange of knowledge and information. When a United Nations volunteer goes out, they always work with counterparts. That can be other volunteers. Sometimes those are government officials at the local district level or the municipality level. And fairly immediately the exchange of information begins. And many volunteers will have said that during the time that they were working abroad, they probably learned as much from that experience as they were actually able to teach other people. And what is very important is that at the regional level, there are many people who understand each other's challenges, that there is a greater understanding of how knowledge is transferred from one country to the other. And we're always very pleased to when we can report to you that, say, 50% of the Korean volunteers are actually working in the Asian region. There's a group that works in Latin America, there's a group that works in Africa, but most of them work in the Asian region. And the knowledge that they acquire after they finish volunteering, they normally bring back to the country and deploy that again in either academia or sometimes in business or sometimes as part of the Korean government. So overall, we believe that volunteering establishes a mutual understanding between countries, helps people to professionally grow in how they learn, but also how they deliver their expertise in other countries. And this will then, at a later stage, normally allow them to work at a more professional level of expertise and a professional level as academics or teachers.
For anyone watching who may want to help out, who may want to volunteer, but don't have the luxury of being able to travel overseas, what are some other ways that they could help out?
Well, from the United Nations, we always like to say, please take a look at our website, onlinevolunteering.org. There's a community there of nearly 300,000 online volunteers from all over the world. And last year, there were nearly 11,000 active volunteers who undertook 16,000 activities online. These are activities for NGOs, civil society organizations, United Nations organizations in developing countries that need technical support. Sometimes it is the review of technical designs of schools or hospital buildings. We've had situations where volunteers were looking at the procurement of equipment and specifications for specific types of specialized equipments. Volunteers were online helping with translation of certain documents from one country to the other for international conferences or for resource mobilization. There is a whole variety of support that you can give without ever leaving the comfort of your home, as long as you have an internet connection and you have good language skills that you can work with the organizations that are looking for your support. Beyond that, I think we also would like to send the message of volunteer within your own community. Volunteer around the corner at your local soccer club. Volunteer around the corner in your local hospital, visiting people who may not have relatives who can take care of them. There are so many different ways that we can volunteer and add value to the society, make a real difference, and grow as human beings. It is incredible. Don't wait to volunteer. Do it today.
We've talked about the messages that the UNV is trying to convey to the international community and the people in it. What then is the underlying goal that United Nations Volunteers is trying to achieve?
Ultimate goal is to make sure that people are engaged in the development process. Volunteers mobilize people and galvanize people around the Millennium Development Goals, or in the future around the Sustainable Development Goals. What we quite often see is that the issue of development investment and policies is simply not enough if that development investment and if those policies do not engage people as actors, as agents of change of their own lives. It is very clear that people nowadays want to participate, want to have a voice, but also want to really make the difference themselves. Volunteering is a key element of doing that, and we are stimulating an intergovernmental discussion about the value of volunteerism for the next development decade, from 2015 to 2025.
Get involved. That is a message we're all trying to convey here. Mr. Dictus, thank you once again for taking time out of your busy schedule to connect with us. We hope to see you here in Korea soon.
Okay, I will definitely put that on my agenda. It was definitely a pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you for watching. We'll see you next time, After 10.